Welcome to This Explainer. In 2026, a massive geopolitical standoff literally halted the modern world. Over this roughly 10-minute historical and geopolitical overview, we're going to dive into the staggering global shock of the Strait of Hormuz crisis and the unchangeable geography and ancient history that made it totally inevitable. We'll explore exactly how a modern military conflict froze the global economy and why this one specific stretch of water has dictated the rise and fall of empires for thousands of years.
We're going to start in the spring of 2026. Suddenly, Brent crude oil just skyrockets to a historic $126 a barrel. And this wasn't just some random market blip. It was the absolute largest disruption to the world's energy supply since the 1970s. Actually, scratch that. It was the biggest shock in the entire history of the world oil market. The sheer speed of this thing was completely unprecedented, and it set off alarm bells in literally every single global market. And the human and logistical scale here? Absolutely massive. Following the military escalations, thousands of people were left stranded in the Persian Gulf overnight. Just imagine the entire global supply chain snapping in an instant. You had 20,000 mariners totally stranded and a quarter of the world's seaborne oil trade completely frozen in place. So you really have to ask yourself, how exactly does one single stretch of water hold so much power over us today? With all our advanced technology, diversified supply chains, and massive global infrastructure, why does the whole system hinge on this one spot? Well, to make sense of the 2026 crisis, we really need to understand the geography.
Section 1. The ultimate geographic choke point.
When you consider the Strait of Hormuz, you realize it's the absolute only sea route connecting the oil-rich Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman, the Arabian Sea, and eventually the broader Indian Ocean. It's wedged right there between Iran to the north and Oman and the United Arab Emirates to the south. Every single drop of seaborne oil leaving the Gulf has to pass right through this exact corridor. Now, here is where it gets crazy. The strait is about 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. That sounds like a decent amount of space, right? But the actual deep water shipping lanes, the ones required for massive modern supertankers, they are just 3 kilometers wide in each direction. It is an incredibly claustrophobic squeeze for vessels that are carrying over 20% of the global oil supply. With such a tiny bottleneck carrying so much of today's critical energy supply, it begs the question, has this specific waterway always been this critical? Like, did ancient civilizations rely on it just as much as we do today?
Let's find out in Section 2, an ancient imperial lifeline.
Way before supertankers, right around 500 BC, the Persian king Darius the Great relied on this exact same stretch of water. He had unified this massive territory, spanning all the way from the Mediterranean Sea to the Indus River Valley. And for his Achaemenid Empire, the Gulf wasn't just some trade route. It was the vital imperial lifeline, linking his far-off eastern provinces straight back to the empire's beating heart in southwestern Iran and Mesopotamia. Even distant superpowers recognized its immense value. Fast forward to 1116 AD, and you have the Roman Emperor Trajan standing at the head of the Persian Gulf during his eastern campaigns. He's watching these ships sail through those waters toward India, and he famously remarked that had he been younger, he would have joined them. And every single one of those ancient ships he watched, they passed right through this very same narrow gateway. And yet, it wasn't until the 3rd century AD, during the late Parthian or early Sasanian period, that this highly strategic spot actually got a name resembling what we call it today, Hormuz. So you see, for thousands of years, this tight 21-mile passage hasn't just been a waterway. It's been the ultimate geopolitical prize and an essential highway for whoever held power in the region. Which brings us straight to Section 3, the 2026 dual blockade. The modern crisis shows us exactly what happens when that historic lifeline gets abruptly cut. The escalation in 2026 was shockingly fast. What started with US and Israeli attacks on Iran in late February spun out of control in less than a month. By March 27th, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps reacted by just flat-out declaring the strait closed. A few weeks later, the U.S. Navy stepped in with its own blockade, which culminated in Operation Project Freedom by May, an escort mission for merchant ships that only briefly paused for ceasefire talks. The Guardian called this a dual blockade, and honestly, they hit the nail on the head. It was a suffocating reality. You had the US Navy actively blocking Iranian ports, while Iran simultaneously heavily mined and restricted the Gulf itself, specifically forbidding passage to vessels from the US, Israel, and their allies. The result? Absolutely nobody could move freely. And diplomacy simply couldn't keep up with the geography. There was a temporary ceasefire on April 8th to try and reopen the strait, but it completely fell apart. And with the failure of broader efforts like the Islamabad talks, the region was plunged right back into a highly volatile, strictly enforced military standoff.
Finally, Section 4, the economic fallout. The economic numbers here are just mind-blowing. The standoff didn't just block a quarter of the world's seaborne oil and 20% of liquefied natural gas. The Persian Gulf is also a massive hub for global fertilizer production. So this closure choked off up to 30% of the world's internationally traded fertilizers. That is completely isolating a massive chunk of the global agricultural foundation. This translated into immediate, terrifying supply chain disruptions. Prices didn't just spike for fuel. Global aluminum production took a huge hit. We saw profound helium shortages, and worldwide agricultural supply chains shuttered because of that fertilizer halt. So we're not just talking about the price of gas at the pump here. This was about the cost of food on your table and the raw materials in your everyday goods. When the Strait of Hormuz closes, the entire global system feels it. So we're left with this really provocative final thought. In an era of incredibly advanced global trade, artificial intelligence, and diversified energy, can we really afford to have our most critical lifelines dictated by one single, unchangeable, ancient choke point? History shows us the enduring power of the Strait of Hormuz, for sure, but the 2026 crisis really forces us to ask, has the modern world finally outgrown the geographic constraints of the past?